Okay, hi, welcome, or I guess what am I doing welcoming you? Thanks for welcoming me. Came all the way across from Stillwater, and I'm happy to be talking with you today, but I do see a lot of familiar faces, so that was kind of fun even during introductions. And I was like, oh, I remember the Artful Rain Gardens program. That was a long time ago, but really fun working on that together. So wanted to, as much as possible in half an hour, talk about things going on in the St. Croix Watershed, the lakes, the rivers, the streams, what's going well, and where there's some, little cause for concern in the future. And I'll try to sandwich it so it's like good, getting worried, good again, so that you leave overall with a good feeling at the end of the meeting. So right off the bat then, let's do that. Here we go. Oh, well, half of my slide went away in the process here. Okay. Oh. All right. Well, that's fine. Really, the main thing that I needed to be able to show you was this map of the whole St. Croix watershed. And what you are looking at here, it kind of looks like the shape of Africa. This is all of the land that eventually drains to the St. Croix River. So it's all going into tributary streams or the lakes or the wetlands. And where it starts is way up here in Solon Springs, Wisconsin. There's a really large wetland complex, and the thing that's kind of cool about it is that from the north end of the wetland complex, there's actually a shorter river called the Boise Brule, and it flows north up to Lake Superior. And then from the south end of the wetland complex, it forms the St. Croix River, goes all the way down, joins with the Mississippi, and all the way down to the Gulf. So this one wetland complex, and then there's like a little 1.5 to 2 mile long portage trail between the two rivers. And that was historically used by Native Americans and French fur traders so that they could cross the entire Great Lakes and be able to get onto the Mississippi River when people were going back and forth trading. So just to note, though, that's an 8,000 square mile watershed. So 8,000 square miles of land that is eventually draining to the St. Croix River. But the St. Croix River itself, for the majority of the river, is part of the national park system. So we're super, super lucky to live next to this national park and not to have to pay an entrance fee like you do at most national parks. The story of how it came to be a national park or protected through the national park system has everything to do with this familiar site. You guys recognize this? The other side of the river, the Allen S. King power plant. So back in the 60s, when it was proposed for this coal burning power plant to get built, people did not want for it to get built. There was a huge outcry. There was a lot of advocacy, organizing to try to prevent it from getting built. And as you can see, it got built anyway. The senators Gaylord Nelson, who was Wisconsin side, and then Walter Mondale on the Minnesota side were very active at a federal level. Instead, what they did succeed in doing was creating a federal wild and scenic rivers program. And so that Wild and Scenic Rivers program was established in 1968. And when it was established, the St. Croix River was one of only 7 rivers nationwide that was added to that Wild and Scenic Rivers list. Today, the Wild and Scenic Rivers program covers about 200 rivers nationwide. So even though we have this, coal-burning power plant here on the river, as a result, we got a really big benefit. So there are all sorts of protections for wild and scenic rivers. And I should mention, too, that this site might be changing in the next 5 or 10 years. This power plant is actually set to get decommissioned in 2028, which is not very far away. So when it does get decommissioned, you for sure will expect to see the smokestack coming down, but it's kind of anybody's guess what is going to happen in the long run. I think it's going to be a really big community conversation about how that land gets redeveloped, and it is still owned by Xcel Energy, so they're probably going to be using it at least partially as a transfer station for other kinds of energy as well. Okay, so Another thing that is nice about the fact that we have this Wild and Scenic Rivers program and, the power plant got built, well, Northern States Power, who owned a lot of the land along the river at the time, then donated vast tracts of land that they owned to, Jesus, I must have been squishing it while I was holding it in my hand. Donated the land to state of Wisconsin, state of Minnesota, and the federal government. And so if you go up on the Minnesota side, you go to Wild River State Park. That is land that was formerly owned by the power company. You go across the river to Governor Nelson State Forest, and this is also land, it's kind of like a long, skinny track along the river. This is also land that was formerly owned by the federal government. And if you go to the National Park Visitor Center, that is also on land that was owned by the power company. So we got all of these public lands that we're now able to hike on and camp and explore and enjoy. We got protections along the riverway, and we have this really beautiful river now. So because it is a wild and scenic river, there are, of course, restrictions on development, that you shouldn't be able to see homes and you shouldn't be able to see buildings while you're out on the river. There's a prohibition against new dams or new road crossings. And so it's really possible to go out and have this wilderness-like experience and only be 20 minutes away from your home, which is something that's really unique. Most of the other wild and scenic rivers that are in the nation are someplace that's really far away. I think it's in Yellowstone. It's, someplace very remote. So we're really lucky to have one that's very close to home. Okay, so let's talk about water quality trends. This is my personal favorite lake. This is Square Lake, which is just north of Stillwater. And I was actually just there last night out doing some open water swimming, but it is one of these ones that is, super well known for having crystal clear water. People actually go scuba diving in it. Perch Lake in Wisconsin is another one that's really well known for having that crystal clear water. But if we look at, sorry, for some reason it's like all the words are gone from the slides and only the images remained. Okay, so what you are looking at right here, the fun, but not always fun part about working in a watershed that crosses two states is that everything is a little bit different on both sides of the river. So, for example, if you wanted to look up where all of the impaired water bodies are, Minnesota has one map and one list, and Wisconsin has another map and another list, and nobody has one that's just a combined one. So what we have here is we have kind of a screen grab of the Minnesota side and a screen grab of the Wisconsin side. And the scary part that you are looking at is that everything that is colored red is classified as impaired. So that's the scary part. Yes?
What do you mean by impaired?
Yes. So there was a Clean Water Act that was passed back in the 70s, and it says that our lakes and our rivers should be swimmable and fishable, that we should, so there's then kind of all these criterion that are established for lakes and streams. And when they are not meeting water quality standards, usually there's kind of like three top reasons. The first most common one is that there's too much nutrients, and so they get a lot of algae blooms. And you have probably heard there's already been several algae blooms on Lake St. Croix this summer. Lake St. Croix has been classified as impaired since 2009 by both states. And so both states are working towards reducing the amount of phosphorus going into the river so that we don't get all those algae blooms. The next most common reason is that there is mercury in the fish tissue. And that's a little trickier to address because it's coming from atmospheric mercury, partially from coal burning power plants, also from some other sources like small-scale gold mining that's happening worldwide, not just in our area. And then I guess trying to think of what the third most common reason, the nutrients, the mercury, sedimentation or turbidity by just having like too much dirt going into the lakes and the rivers. This is particularly a problem for the rivers and streams. So anyway, they get classified as impaired, and then when they're classified as impaired, that triggers this whole regulatory framework that the communities have to snap to action and do a lot of work, which is expensive and difficult and time consuming to fix the lakes and the rivers. So, you know, we would prefer that things just stay good in the first place, because it's a lot easier to keep things good when they're good than to try to fix them up once they're impaired. So the better thing that you can look at right now is all of these purple spots. These are all lakes and streams that have been delisted in the past 10 years or so, and that means that they got cleaned up. So this is the part where you all get to cheer like, yay, we did it, yay! So these are all ones that didn't used to meet water quality standards. Local communities worked really hard, and you know, they do once again. So I'm just gonna kind of fast forward right through this one. You're gonna have to forgive me for being somewhat Minnesota-centric. I'm trying really hard to, you know, cover both sides of the river, but my knowledge base where I work is really, you know, really heavy on the Minnesota knowledge. On Washington County, about 50% of our lakes have improving water quality. And I can just share a whole bunch that got delisted in the past 4 years. In 2022, we had 7 lakes that got delisted. So you can see some images, and it was kind of all over the board. Some of them were in very rural areas. Some of them are in more suburban areas. The one that I was most excited about, coming up here, was Lily Lake in Stillwater. This is one that was 25 years in the making. You know, when you talk about how hard it is to get water quality back up to standards, this was 2002 that community members started advocating, talking to the city council, talking to the state, and saying, we are not happy. This used to be a crystal clear lake. It used to be one of these destination lakes, kind of like Square Lake, where, you know, people would set up, they had vendors, there was beach parties, there was all sorts of things going on. And, you know, it had gotten to the point where it was algae blooms, nobody was swimming in the lake anymore. But from that moment when they started advocating until when we were officially able to take it off the impaired waters list, and what we're doing with this fire right here, this little piece of paper, we were, boom, setting on fire the listing, is that, you know, it was a really hard work, a lot of money and a lot of effort that went into that. In Washington County, we have been working really, really hard to get private and public landowners to install conservation projects that help to create habitat and also reduce runoff pollution to the lakes and the rivers and streams. So all 5,544 of these dots are conservation projects. Woo! This is the part where you cheer again. You're like, yay, that's really impressive. And you can see it's this enormous, you know, number of pounds of phosphorus that have been removed, an enormous number of pounds of sediment that have been removed that are no longer going off of the landscape. So it's a lot of work, but it's rewarding. So just as we're cheering, this is the part where I do the icky part of the sandwich, the middle part of the sandwich. Just as we're cheering and we're like, the water quality is getting better, it's clearer again, then we're starting to notice that we've got some lakes where the water is clear, but then it's almost like a bathtub. It's like, hey, the water's clear, but there's not really any fish in it, or there's just not as many fish, not the variety of fish that we used to have. So we're realizing that loss of biodiversity due to shoreline development is really becoming an issue. And we've had several lakes in Minnesota, at least, that got classified as impaired. Oh, you just have to guess what this was gonna say. What it does say is that across the state of Minnesota, at least, we've lost about 50% of our natural shorelines over all time, and are losing them at a rate of 1% to 2% per decade. So if we keep going in this direction, you know, a couple more decades, and we really have very little shoreline habitat left. And then, of course, on the St. Croix River, even though we have wild and scenic river protections that are supposed to prevent development from happening right along the shoreline, there are examples where it happens anyway. You know, rules only work when people kind of generally agree to follow the rules. And so, if somebody breaks a rule, that makes it really challenging a lot of times for local and state government to enforce the rule, and can translate into a lot of really expensive legal challenges. So bluffland development continues to be a challenge. One of our big focal points for the past 3 years, and will be continuing into the future, is working with lakeshore and riverfront landowners and saying, hey, you still get to have a lawn. You still can have a little beach. You still can have a dock. But could we have a landscape that looks more like this? Where we have some natural habitat for the nesting loons and for the beavers and for the frogs and for the turtles and for the insects that the fish need to eat. We have some beautiful pollinator plants, but we're protecting the lake quality and still giving you a place to enjoy the lake. So that's one challenge we're seeing. Chloride impairment is another challenge that is really coming into, I guess it's starting to hit like the very worried, not quite panicked, but very worried. Road salt, obviously, is just kind of a fact of life in the northern states. And for years, chloride levels in lakes and streams have been gradually going up. Well, we're finally at the point now where we have 67 lakes and streams in Minnesota, 51 in Wisconsin, that are all now impaired by having too much chloride. And the thing that is really challenging with chloride in comparison with some of these other issues like the phosphorus or the sediment is that we don't have anything we can do about it. Like, we can't build a rain garden to get rid of it. We can't just plant a buffer strip to get rid of it. Once it's in the water, it's basically in the water, and we don't have a way to get it out. So the only thing we can do is put less salt on the ground. In Minnesota, we have a training program that's been going for 15 years now, where we offer it up to the municipalities, the plow drivers, and people who are doing parking lot and sidewalk maintenance, that's focused on here's strategies for how you can reduce the amount of salt you're using while still maintaining public safety. And then in some places, they're starting to get creative, like City of Cottage Grove, City of Woodbury. They've both installed heated sidewalks at some of their public buildings so that it's a way they just don't even have to use salt at all. But this one is scary because, like I said, even if we're using less salt, we're just kind of, heading towards the same problem more slowly, if you know what I mean. It's something that's gonna be a big concern, and obviously we've got freshwater, and so freshwater organisms, the salt is toxic to them, and it's something that's gonna be a big concern in the future. On the good side, mercury levels are starting to fall because in the US at least, there's been a big movement away from coal burning power generation. And also at the state levels in Minnesota and Wisconsin, they've spent a lot of effort on, things like getting rid of mercury thermometers and working with industrial businesses to change the emissions that are getting sent out into the environment, change the way waste is managed. So there are 1,608 lakes in Minnesota with fish consumption advisories due to mercury, 446 in Wisconsin. One of the things that's kind of weird, it's like, hey, why is Minnesota doing so bad compared to Wisconsin on this, is that it doesn't actually have anything to do with the surrounding landscape, the mercury issue. Mercury actually affects very far northern lakes and in really remote areas, like even in the boundary waters, even up in Canada, because it all has to do with how it gets in the atmosphere and how it falls down into the lakes. So I think that really has more to do with the fact that Minnesota just has a lot of lakes that are really far north. But amazingly, in 2020, Minnesota was able to take 12 lakes off of that list that no longer have mercury impairments. And to be honest, they aren't quite entirely sure how it came to be that the mercury levels went down in the lakes, but Forest Lake is one of them that's in our local watershed and no longer has too much mercury. Yeah.
2 slides back, there was the term WWTP.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yep, sorry, I should have not glazed over that. Wastewater treatment plants. So in addition to the road salt, the salt that we use in water softeners is another challenge, and it ends up in our groundwater if it's going into a septic field, or it ends up in the river if we are in an urban area where it's going to the wastewater treatment plant, because in general, the chloride isn't getting taken out before it gets discharged. They're taking, they're processing the bacteria and other kinds of pollutants, but not necessarily salt. Yeah. And then one more on the big scary list is that we have this big issue, especially on the Minnesota side of the river, with PFAS. And in particular, in the Twin Cities East Metro, we've got PFAS from historic dumping from 3M. It was used to make nonstick pans and Teflon, Scotchgard, firefighting foam, things like that. But unfortunately, it is now wormed its way into not just the groundwater drinking water supply for, basically the entire county, but also all of these lakes and streams. Now it's in the St. Croix River. So I fear that you might be seeing a fish consumption advisory on the St. Croix due to PFAS in the next couple of years, because it did already get a PFAS impairment on the Minnesota side, at least.
I'm going to ask a question for John.
Yeah.
What is PFAS?
I know. Me telling you won't make it any more understandable. It's like perfluorooctanated substances.
Perfect.
The phrase that people have been using is forever chemicals. They're really these long compounds that have a very, very, very long half-life. It takes a long time for them to break down. And there's this whole, it's like, well, what's the impact of having PFAS? And, there's all these studies, and it's like, well, it could contribute to higher cholesterol, it could contribute to diabetes, it could contribute to this kind of cancer. It's one of those kind of Aaron Brockovich type situations. So in terms of what we're worried about, the other thing that we've been worried about for generations now is the impact of farming and the way we grow food on our local lakes and rivers. And we have some really, really awesome local farmers. And we have really great farm incentive programs. I'm showing you Pam Arnold, who is up in Scandia. She's holding up this Minnesota Water Quality Certification sign. We've got all sorts of farmers who are working with us on, putting in sediment basins. This cow up here is at Mallory Farm in Chisago County, where they worked with the local soil and water conservation district to do a really huge manure treatment system. So there are really great farmers, but right now all of our efforts with farming are based on voluntary participation. And it's like 70 to 80% of the sediment, phosphorus, nitrogen going into the whole St. Croix River and the whole Mississippi River is coming from farming. And we don't really have any regulations to stand on. It's all based on hoping that people will happen to work with us and that we have enough money to give them incentives to work with them. And having enough money is, of course, challenging because we usually don't. So that continues to be a problem. I'm going to hit some of the kind of cool trends that we're seeing in the area. I bet y'all are familiar with this view, right? Yeah. So one of the fun things that has been happening is a movement towards removing dams. And I know on the Minnesota side, at least, they've removed 50 dams in the past 30 years, statewide, Minnesota DNR. And in the St. Croix Watershed, there is the Willow River, Minnesota side, not your side. Although, then there have also been a couple of dams that came out, on this Willow River. I know, I'm trying to remember because you see where my words were. My words were right here to remind me exactly what year the dams came out. The Grindstone River, which is up in Sandstone, Minnesota, is scheduled to have a dam removed. And then, of course, if you're familiar with River Falls, both of those dams on the Kinnickinnick River are scheduled to get removed in the next couple of years once they figure out the money part. Just that little part. The money and logistics part. But this is really great because, of course, dams inhibit the natural movement of fish. They tend to cause a lot of sediment and pollutants and stuff to kind of all back up in one location. So taking the dams out is one way of rewilding streams. We've also been doing a lot of work on re-meandering smaller streams that had been historically ditched. So if you look at this image over here, when people came in and started farming, in a lot of places they would take what used to be a wiggly stream and they'd make it straight to get the water to go where they wanted it to. And streams don't like that. Streams, they like to have room to overflow during the spring snow melt. Places that are wiggly where it creates different kinds of habitat for different kinds of insects and fish. And so what we're doing now is going in and re-meandering a lot of these streams. So this is trout brook that goes through Afton Alps and Afton State Park. And this is prior to it getting re-meandered. Did I go backwards or there we go. Okay. The South Washington Watershed District has been working with both landowners and the DNR. And you can kind of see, I'll just use my pointer here. You can kind of see this is the old stream channel, and then they constructed this new wiggly channel. And then once that was done, there was just this one day where they just kind of went, oop, and they turned off the old one and turned on the new one. And so now the water is flowing through the new stream channel. But there was about 15 years of work leading up to this re-meander project where they were working with upland landowners, people who had farmlands, correcting eroding ravines, all sorts of things that were going on. And the cool thing is this was called Trout Brook, but for about a 10-year stretch of time, it didn't have any trout in it. And then the trout started coming back, and they actually came from the Wisconsin side. They were on the Kinnickinnick River, and they just swam themselves across the river and found their way over to Trout Brook on the Minnesota side. But then the Minnesota DNR last fall actually released 2,500 little baby heritage brook trout. These are our native species of trout that we have in our area. So that was really exciting. We had a big event and we had people from the community come out and we all got to dump. I thought I was gonna get to put 2 little fish in the stream. Each of us got to put an entire bucket of fish in the stream. It was very fun. So hoping that those little heritage brook trout keep growing and get big and bodacious in the coming years. Browns Creek, which goes through Stillwater, has a nice trail along it. They just got done with a similar re-meander project there and are probably going to be releasing baby trout in the fall. And if you make your way up to Marina and St. Croix, there's the Brookside Bar and Grill. That was actually the location of the first ever commercial sawmill in the St. Croix region. It's now a great place to have a drink or have a burger. And the kind of claim to fame is that this mill stream goes right through the restaurant because, of course, it used to be a mill. So it goes right through the basement of the restaurant. And the Watershed District is planning on working with the city and doing kind of not necessarily a re-meander, but there's all sorts of old creosote logs and falling down concrete and things that historically served a function and don't anymore that are going to get cleaned up in the coming years. So just some of the regional partners that are working in the St. Croix Basin. Wild Rivers Conservancy is a nonprofit organization. Their office is up in Osceola, and they are the official friends group for the national park. So they do all sorts of programming. They do advocacy around protecting the St. Croix River. Then there's also Northwoods and Waters of the St. Croix Heritage Area, which is a little bit more focused on celebrating the stories, the arts, the culture, supporting local communities. And there is an initiative which has been going for 10 or 15 years now to try to get the whole watershed designated as a national heritage area. It unfortunately requires an act of Congress to happen, so I don't know how soon that will happen. But it would be exciting because it could bring some tourism revenue to our area. On the Minnesota side, We have this great partnership, that the Lower St. Croix partnership, that kind of goes from, all of Washington. It's got Isani, Anoka, Chisago, a little bit of Pine, where we've been working together for, I guess it was 3 years that we were making a plan, and we're in year 5 now of plan implementation. And we're actually getting like $2.5 million from the state every 2 years to implement projects and programs on our side of the river. So that's really spurred a lot of activity, and also helped to promote a lot of collaboration between the local government partners on that side of the river. And one more thing to mention, and I know that I'm going to see Buck on the river next week. Every year we do a St. Croix River workshop on the water, and we have Minnesota and Wisconsin state and local government partner to put this on. And it is actually specifically intended for local decision makers. So people who are like city council, county commissioner, planning commission members, and we get everybody on the boat out of either Hudson, Stillwater, Taylor's Falls, and talk about some of the issues and what their role is in helping to protect the river and local lakes. So we're doing that next week, Wednesday, up in Taylor's Falls, and expecting a good turnout. And what was it? It's going to be 70 degrees, slightly breezy, not raining, not not too hot, something like that. All right. And, just want to make sure to put in that last plug. Most of the land in Minnesota and Wisconsin is privately owned. So even though it is great to have local, state, federal government working on protecting our lakes and rivers, it actually also takes all of us agreeing to do small things like planting a rain garden, planting a native planting, restoring some of our woodlands, maintaining our shoreline. It's really what it's going to take for us to be able to continue to have a beautiful river and lakes and continue to get to enjoy living in this beautiful place that we do. So if you need my contact information, I've got it right up here in the screen, and this time these words stayed, so that's lucky. Those words stayed. And I'm happy to, answer any questions in the next couple of minutes.
We have about 5 minutes for questions.
Perfect.
I apologize if you covered this. How is phosphorus removed from the waters?
Sure, so phosphorus is a naturally occurring nutrient, and all lakes and rivers need to have at least some, because this is kind of a building block that feeds all of the aquatic plants that are in the water. And the challenge is just when we have too much phosphorus, then we get too many plants, and in particular, too much of the algae. So what we do is first we try to limit the amount of phosphorus that is coming in to the lakes or into the rivers. And we do that by things like planting rain gardens, so the runoff goes through a rain garden and gets treated before it goes down to the lake. In communities, we're doing a lot of targeted enhanced street sweeping. So the street sweepers, they're picking up all of that sand and grit off the ground. That's actually collecting a lot of phosphorus that would get washed into the water by the storm sewers. On farm fields, it's working with the farmers on having nutrient management plans where they're not putting down too much phosphorus. And then there's also buffer strips or sediment basins. So that all keeps it from getting in the water. But then there always is this point in time where we're like, okay, we've controlled everything coming in, but there's still everything that's already there. And so usually the final step after 15, 20 years of doing this is that they'll do an alum treatment. And alum, it's not toxic. It's, you actually use it in your kitchen sometimes. You'll have it in, one of those little shakers. But they put it in the water, and it binds the existing phosphorus to the sediment at the bottom of the lake, and then it's still there. It's just, stuck down in the sediment instead of feeding the algae and the aquatic plants. So, yeah, so I know, and it's funny because in general, most of the rules are the same, except for the fact that in this lower riverway, because it was already so developed, there's so much existing stuff that was kind of grandfathered in, so to speak. And then, like you said, there's basically from the boom site south, it is the local government that is in charge of enforcing the riverway rules instead of the National Park Service. Like once you get north of there, if you have a scenic easement, the National Park Service is actually the one that sends out a letter every year and says, you know, we're just checking to make sure that you haven't cut down any trees and that, you know, everything is still doing well in the scenic easement. Once you get down here, then it is up to the local cities and townships or county, you know, whoever's the local zoning authority to be enforcing those rules. And that can make it challenging because, you know, you've got all these little communities that are very, very short-staffed and have really, really small budgets that are now kind of having to enforce rules against people who might have a lot of money, like a lot of money. So